What would you do if a DNA test revealed your children weren't yours? Could you forgive and move on? Or would rage take over? It's one of those situations we all think could never happen to us. But for one Texas preacher, Daniel Whitaker, this nightmare became a reality. And what happened next is something straight out of a horror story. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next mind-blowing crime. Your support keeps the stories of the deceased alive. In the quiet, rural town of Meadow Creek, Texas, there was a preacher everyone admired, Pastor Daniel Whitaker. He was the kind of man who could light up a room with his sermons, who counseled couples through their darkest days, and who always seemed to have the answers when life threw its hardest punches. He was more than a religious leader. He was a symbol of strength, morality, and community. But behind closed doors, something was festering, something that no one in the congregation could have guessed. A secret so devastating, so earth-shattering, that it didn't just destroy a family, it led to an unthinkable act of violence. It all started with what should have been a moment of clarity, a DNA test, a simple piece of paper that revealed a truth no one could have prepared for. His 4 children, Emily, 16, Ben, 14, Sophie, 9, and little Noah, just 5, the ones he raised, the ones he prayed for, the ones he poured his life into, were not his, not biologically at least. What followed was a storm of emotions, betrayal, anger, disbelief, and then something darker took over. This man of God, this pillar of the community, crossed a line no one thought he was capable of crossing. What drove him to such a horrifying act? Was it the betrayal, the humiliation, or was there something deeper, something no one could see until it was too late? This story is not just about a crime. It's about trust, deception, and the fragile line between love and fury. Stay with me as we uncover the chilling details of a pastor-turned-killer, where love, betrayal, and rage collide in ways you could never imagine. Let's start with the man at the center of this storm, Pastor Daniel Whitaker. Daniel was more than just a preacher in Meadow Creek. He was a beacon of hope. For nearly 2 decades, he led the town's largest church, Grace Fellowship Baptist, delivering powerful sermons that left people feeling inspired and renewed. He was the kind of man people turned to when they were lost, a trusted confidant, a spiritual leader who seemed to embody the values he preached. His life looked like a dream. A devoted wife by his side, 4 beautiful children who attended Sunday school without fail, and a home that always seemed filled with warmth and love. From the outside, Daniel Whitaker had it all: a perfect family, a perfect career, a perfect reputation. But how often do we look at someone's life and think they have it all? And how often are we completely wrong? Then there was his wife, Laura Whitaker. By all appearances, Laura was the kind of woman who completed the image of a perfect pastor's family. She was deeply involved in the church, organizing charity events, leading women's Bible studies, and always standing by her husband during Sunday services. She was seen as a devoted wife, someone who embodied grace and humility, but as we'd later discover, Laura had secrets. Secrets that would unravel everything the Whitakers had built. Behind her kind smile, there was a truth she kept hidden, one that would eventually destroy their family and her husband's reputation. Was Laura a victim of her own circumstances? Or was she an architect of the chaos that followed? And then there were the kids, 4 of them, each one a reflection of the Whitakers' seemingly perfect life. Emily, 16, was the confident, straight-A student. Ben, 14, was the athlete, always on the soccer field or basketball court. Sophie, 9, had a quiet creativity about her, spending hours drawing and writing in her notebooks. And Noah, just 5, was the adorable, mischievous baby of the family who brought laughter wherever he went. The Whitaker kids were the picture of innocence, and their lives were intertwined with the church and community. They were the kind of family people admired from a distance, the kind of family that made you believe in stability and faith. But what happens when that perfect picture is just an illusion? How do you reconcile the truth when everything you thought you knew turns out to be a lie? And what happens when that lie cuts so deep it changes the very core of who you are? The answers to those questions lie at the heart of this chilling tale, And as we continue, you'll see how this seemingly idyllic family became the center of a story so shocking, so tragic, that it left an entire town, and eventually the entire nation, reeling. Sometimes, the smallest things can plant the biggest doubts. For Pastor Daniel Whitaker, it started as a faint whisper in the back of his mind. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something didn't sit right. Maybe it was a passing comment from an old friend at a church gathering, something meant as a joke. "You know, Ben looks a lot like your neighbor Rick. You guys must have some strong genes around here." At first, Daniel laughed it off. Rick Sanders, the Whitakers' next-door neighbor, was practically family. Rick was a handyman who'd helped fix the leaky roof on their house, a familiar face at weekend barbecues, and someone who never missed a chance to lend a helping hand. The kids adored him. Ben, in particular, had taken to shadowing Rick around the yard, soaking up his every word. But the joke lingered in Daniel's mind longer than it should have. The resemblance, was it really just a coincidence? He brushed it off, telling himself he was overthinking things. But then he started noticing the small things. Ben's laugh sounded eerily similar to Rick's. Emily had the same piercing blue eyes as Rick, a shade neither Daniel nor Laura had. Little Noah, with his untamable hair and cheeky grin, looked more like Rick than anyone else in the family. Still, Daniel told himself not to read too much into it. He loved his children. He had raised them, nurtured them, and prayed for them. These were his kids. He was their father. But as the days turned into weeks, the doubts grew louder, refusing to be silenced. Then came the comment that finally tipped the scales. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Laura was chatting with Rick in the backyard while the kids played. Daniel overheard Rick laughing and saying, "You know, Laura, those kids are my pride and joy." It was meant as a light-hearted remark, but it hit Daniel like a freight train. The way Laura laughed nervously, the way she quickly changed the subject, it was as if she was hiding something. That night, as Daniel lay in bed next to Laura, he couldn't shake the feeling. The questions swirled in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. What if it's true? What if the kids aren't mine? He tried to reason with himself. Does it really matter? I've raised them as my own. I love them. But another voice, the voice of doubt, kept asking, "Don't you deserve to know the truth? Can you live the rest of your life pretending this question doesn't exist?" And so Daniel found himself at a crossroads. What would you do in his shoes? If you noticed something strange about your children, would you want to know the truth? Or would you let it go, protecting the love and bond you've built? For Daniel, the need for answers was too great to ignore. He couldn't carry the weight of the uncertainty any longer. So one quiet evening, while Laura and the kids were out, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He ordered a DNA test kit online. It was simple, quick, and anonymous. But the results would be anything but simple. The test results arrived a week later, tucked inside an unassuming envelope. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened it. He wasn't ready for what he was about to read. But there was no turning back now. As his eyes scanned the paper, the world around him seemed to fall away. The results were clear. Not one of his 4 children was biologically his. Not Emily, not Ben, not Sophie, not even little Noah. The shock was immediate and suffocating. He sat there, staring at the words on the page, hoping they would change, praying it was some kind of mistake. But the science didn't lie. His mind raced. How? Why? Was it possible that every single one of them? Betrayal washed over him like a tidal wave. The memories of family vacations, bedtime stories, first steps, and first words now felt tainted, as if they belonged to someone else. The life he thought he had built with Laura, the trust, the love, the partnership, crumbled in an instant. He felt the walls closing in, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and despair. How could she have done this to him? How long had she been lying? Was he just a convenient cover for her secrets? He paced the room, replaying every moment of their marriage. Suddenly, little details that once seemed insignificant now felt glaringly obvious. The way Laura sometimes avoided eye contact when he talked about how proud he was of the kids, the way she deflected questions about their early years, the way Rick was always just a little too involved in their lives. And then came the guilt. Daniel loved those children more than anything in the world. He had raised them, taught them, and sacrificed for them. But now he couldn't help but question everything. Were they truly his children in any way that mattered? Could he continue to love them as he had before? And what about Rick? Could it really be him? The pieces started to fall into place. The friendly neighbor who was always around, the casual jokes, the easy familiarity with Laura. Was Rick just a good friend? Or had he been something more all along? Daniel's mind was a storm of emotions. Heartbreak, fury, confusion, and the unbearable weight of betrayal. He didn't know how to confront Laura. He didn't know how to face Rick. But one thing was certain. His life would never be the same. What would you do if your entire life turned out to be a lie? How do you even begin to process something like this? Daniel knew he needed answers, but he also knew that the truth might destroy him. And so, as the clock ticked late into the night, Daniel sat alone with the DNA test results in his hands, a man torn between the love he had always known and the rage he couldn't contain. What he did next would shock everyone and leave a small Texas town rumbling. From the outside, Pastor Daniel Whitaker seemed to carry on as usual. Sunday sermons were still delivered with the same conviction, his voice steady as he spoke of faith, forgiveness, and resilience. The congregation continued to look up to him as a pillar of strength, a man whose life exemplified the virtues he preached. But behind closed doors, Daniel was unraveling. The betrayal had taken root deep within him, consuming his thoughts day and night. He couldn't escape it. Every smile from Laura felt like a dagger to his chest. Every laugh from the children, a cruel reminder of the lie he was living. Daniel tried to pray through it, to lean on his faith, but his prayers felt hollow. How could he seek forgiveness for his anger when the betrayal cut so deep? He questioned everything: his marriage, his role as a father, even his relationship with God. In the quiet hours of the night, he would sit alone in the living room, staring at family photos on the mantel. The images that once brought him joy now mocked him. He couldn't stop himself from scrutinizing every detail, every resemblance to Rick. Was it always so obvious? Had everyone else known while he was left in the dark? The weight of the secret began to seep into every part of his life. At church, he started stumbling over his words, losing his train of thought mid-sermon. His once warm demeanor grew colder, more distant. Congregants noticed, but Daniel dismissed their concerns with a forced smile and a vague excuse about feeling under the weather. At home, the tension was palpable. Laura could sense something was wrong, but every time she asked, Daniel brushed her off. He couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed more time to process, to decide what to do. But the more he waited, the more his anger simmered. He began to avoid Rick, no longer able to stomach the sight of the man who had stolen so much from him. Yet Rick seemed oblivious, still coming around with his easygoing charm, still making the kids laugh. Each visit felt like a fresh wound, and Daniel's resentment only grew. The children, unaware of the storm brewing around them, carried on as usual. But Daniel found it harder and harder to look at them the same way. He hated himself for it, hated the way his love for them was being overshadowed by his pain. These were his kids. They always would be. But the shadow of betrayal loomed over every interaction, poisoning even the purest moments. The man who had once been a beacon of faith and stability was now a prisoner of his own torment. And the more he tried to hold it together, the more the cracks began to show. What would you do in his position? Could you forgive something so devastating, or does anger consume even the most righteous among us? For Daniel, forgiveness felt like an impossibility. The betrayal had taken on a life of its own, feeding his darkest thoughts. He tried to suppress it, to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was a losing battle. And as the days turned into weeks, his anger began to take a darker turn. The tension in the Whitaker household grew unbearable. Arguments between Daniel and Laura became more frequent, more heated. She accused him of shutting her out, of being cold and distant. He, in turn, lashed out with passive-aggressive remarks, each one laced with the bitterness he couldn't fully express. Laura had no idea what was truly eating away at Daniel, but she could feel the change in him. And deep down, perhaps she knew that the fragile illusion she had worked so hard to maintain was beginning to crumble. And then came the night when everything changed. The night when Daniel's rage finally consumed him. It was a quiet evening in the Whitaker household, the kind where nothing seems out of the ordinary. Laura had just tucked the kids into bed, and Daniel sat in the kitchen staring at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The silence between them was heavy, the air thick with unspoken words. Laura approached him, her voice soft but cautious. "Daniel, we need to talk. I can't keep living like this. What's going on with you?" For a moment, he didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the cup in front of him, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. And then, slowly, he stood up. "You want to know what's wrong, Laura," he said, his voice low and steady. "What's wrong is that I've been living a lie. My entire life has been a lie." Laura's face paled. She tried to speak, but Daniel cut her off, his voice rising with each word. "How long, Laura? How long were you going to keep this from me? How long were you going to let me believe I was their father?" She froze, the weight of his words sinking in. "Daniel, I don't," he snapped, slamming his hand down on the table. "Don't you dare try to deny it. I know, Laura. I know everything." What happened next is still a matter of speculation. Only 2 people were in that room, and one of them wouldn't live to tell the tale. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices, the sound of shattering glass, and then silence. When Laura didn't show up for work the next day, her co-workers grew concerned. Calls to her phone went unanswered, and by evening, one of her friends decided to file a missing person report. At first, Daniel played the part of the worried husband, telling police he had no idea where Laura could be. He claimed she had left the house after an argument and never returned. But something about his demeanor didn't sit right with investigators. His story was too rehearsed, his emotions too controlled. It wasn't long before the cracks in his story began to show. Inconsistencies in his timeline, strange behavior, and a suspicious lack of concern for Laura's whereabouts all pointed to something darker. And then came the discovery that shocked everyone. Police were called to the Whitaker residence after a neighbor reported a foul odor coming from the backyard. What they found was beyond comprehension. Laura's dismembered remains were buried in shallow graves, hastily concealed beneath a layer of dirt and leaves. The scene was gruesome, the work of someone who had acted with both rage and calculation. As investigators pieced together the evidence, a chilling picture began to emerge. The respected preacher, the man of faith and community, had committed an act so brutal, so unimaginable, that it left even seasoned detectives shaken. But the story doesn't end here. What came next shocked even the most hardened investigators and revealed a layer of darkness no one could have anticipated. The discovery of Laura Whitaker's remains sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. The man they had trusted, the man they had looked to for spiritual guidance, was now the center of a horrifying murder investigation. But how had it all unraveled? What led investigators to uncover the truth behind the gruesome crime? It started with the inconsistencies in Daniel's story. From the moment he reported Laura missing, his timeline didn't add up. He claimed she had walked out late at night after an argument, but there were no witnesses to corroborate this. And then there was the surveillance footage. Security cameras from a nearby street showed no sign of Laura leaving the house that night. Investigators grew suspicious, and their attention turned to the Whitaker residence. A search warrant was issued, and what they found in Daniel's backyard confirmed their worst fears. The shallow graves, hastily dug and poorly concealed, contained remains that left no doubt about what had transpired. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. Inside the house, forensic teams uncovered traces of blood in the kitchen and bathroom, traces that someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to clean. The discovery of Laura's personal belongings, discarded alongside cleaning supplies, painted a chilling picture of a man who had meticulously planned to cover his tracks, only to fail. When Daniel was brought in for questioning, his demeanor was unsettling. He didn't break down or plead his innocence. Instead, he was eerily composed, He answered questions with calculated precision, offering vague explanations and denying any involvement in Laura's disappearance. But his calm exterior only raised more red flags. In court, Daniel's composure cracked. As the prosecution laid out their case, detailing the betrayal, the DNA revelation, and the growing resentment that culminated in murder, Daniel appeared less like the righteous preacher he once was and more like a man consumed by his own darkness. Witnesses testified to his erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to Laura's disappearance, painting a picture of a man unraveling under the weight of his own turmoil. But one question lingered in the minds of everyone watching the case unfold. What role, if any, did Rick play in the fallout? The neighbor, once a close family friend, had seemingly vanished from the narrative. He wasn't called to testify, and his name was conspicuously absent from the prosecution's case. Some speculated that he had fled town to escape the scandal, while others believed he was staying silent to protect his own reputation. What do you think? Was Rick simply an unwitting catalyst in a tragedy born of betrayal? Or was there more to his relationship with Laura than anyone realized? And could his actions, or inaction, have played a role in what happened next? In the wake of the trial, the community was left reeling. How had it come to this? How had a man who preached forgiveness and faith fallen so far? The tragedy raised questions not just about Daniel's actions, but about the consequences of secrets and betrayal. Laura's choices had set off a chain reaction that no one could have anticipated. Her deception, born perhaps out of fear or desperation, had shattered the foundation of her family. But was her betrayal enough to justify what followed? And what of the children? They were the silent victims in all of this, their lives forever changed by the actions of the adults they trusted most. How would they cope with the knowledge of what had happened? How would they reconcile the love they felt for their father with the horror of his crime? The ripple effects of this tragedy extended far beyond the Whitaker family. The congregation Daniel once led was left in shock, their faith shaken by the man they had idolized. Some questioned how they could have been so blind, while others struggled to reconcile their beliefs with the actions of their former pastor. It's easy to judge from the outside, to say what you would have done differently, but the truth is we never really know how we would react in the face of such betrayal, such devastation. So, what do you think? Was this an act of madness, of justice, or something deeper? Was Daniel driven to the edge by betrayal, or were there darker secrets in his past that no one saw coming? And perhaps most importantly, could this tragedy have been avoided? If the truth had come out earlier, if conversations had been had, could this family have been saved? We want to hear from you. What would you have done in Daniel's shoes? Do you believe he was a victim of circumstance, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface all along? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could shed new light on this haunting story. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next mind-blowing crime documentary. Your support keeps the stories of the deceased alive.